I'm really glad to be here this morning. I hope that none of you ended up in here by accident. This is a chance for me to talk about the past, the present, and the future of the state treasury. And that's normally a good way to clear a room. So if you want to sneak out, now's your chance. It is good to be back here on campus. It was almost 25 years ago that I followed my own Oregon trail here to Willamette from Idaho. In those days, I was sitting in chairs, much like you, hoping that the lecture would be about something interesting, maybe like you. In those days, as today, it was hard to walk around campus and not catch glimpses of the gleaming Oregon pioneer, just a block away from campus, sitting on top the seat of Oregon government. And the proximity to the Capitol has, of course, meant that hundreds of Willamette students through the years have been able to learn firsthand about the gears of government, and many have gone on to make careers serving all of us. So I want you to think about something for a minute. As many places as you can see the pioneer from the Willamette campus, it can't see you. Yes, it's a statue. It's 22 feet high, 8.5 tons. It was built by a German immigrant, and it was installed in 1938 when the Capitol was rebuilt and reopened after a devastating fire. The pioneer itself faces north and, as you'd probably expect, looks to the west, Willamette being immediately to the south. So that means that no matter what was happening on campus, the pioneer was always looking the other way. And as a parent of 2 young children, I've come to understand that that probably means one of 3 things. 1, the pioneer has a great deal of trust about what's going on here on campus. Or 2, he didn't actually realize we're here. Or 3, he just can't bear to watch. And sometimes that's perfectly understandable. Sometimes there are things happening on campus that no one would want to watch, like if I was trying to shoot free throws, for example. It's not pretty. But when it comes to the Oregon Treasury, I think most Oregon citizens are not unlike the gold statue. For the most part, they don't even know we exist. In fact, most Oregonians, I think, don't realize we have a state treasurer. And then when I show up, they try to hide their wallets because they think I'm a tax collector. But it's okay, I'm not. Don't worry. There is also the wrinkle that Treasury is part of our state government, and there are a lot of people who are just down on government these days. It means that many people choose not to pay attention or are just generally suspicious. I'm working hard with my team and driving a lot of miles to try to help dispel that suspicion. So I've been looking forward to this opportunity this morning to talk with you today, not just about the nuts and bolts of what we do at Treasury, but also about how we are helping to connect some critically important dots for every Oregonian. My title for today is A Legacy of Empowering the Financial Future for Oregonians. And I'm going to break up my thoughts into 2 chapters. We'll take a break, and I want lots of conversation and questions. So please be thinking of things. I see many of you have pen and paper. That's good. Please take some notes. I'm not going to learn that much from what I'm saying because I already know it. I want to hear what you think and what you're concerned about. So that time will come, and I hope you'll be ready. So first I want to talk about how we got here and where we stand today. And then after the break, we can talk about where Treasury's headed. For us, the bottom line is this: your financial health matters. And that's whether you're an Oregon citizen, a state agency, a school district, or a business. And it's where your state treasury comes in. What that means also is evolving. We're a multifaceted and problem-solving financial enterprise that makes Oregon better in ways you can and can't see. And the role of the Oregon treasurer is changing as well. At the time of statehood, Treasury, the state treasurer was the state's bookkeeper and accountant. Today, I'm responsible for hundreds of billions of dollars of banking transactions and investments. And at the same time, the treasurer is increasingly expected to be more than just a person who signs checks. Oregonians want a financial leader who cares not just about numbers, but helps them to build a better quality of life. Well, first, I want to give a little crash course on what the Oregon Treasury does, and just as notably, what we don't do. The Treasury is where the business of government happens for Oregon. And when I say business, I'm not talking about all the important end goals that government accomplishes, like educating our next generation or keeping Oregonians safer or protecting the environment. What I mean by business is the business of government. I mean money changing hands. Very little happens without money, without actual money, and that's where we do our work as Treasury. You don't always see what we do, but you almost always feel it. At Treasury, we don't decide the state's spending priorities, and we don't write the budget. There's a separation of power here. The legislature passes bills and has one constitutional requirement: to pass a balanced budget. The governor proposes that budget, signs legislation, and directs agencies. As an independently elected constitutional officer, I lead a team that is increasingly part of that budgetary conversation. Treasury does not stand idly by and keep our opinions to ourselves. In fact, as the state's financial experts, we are increasingly asked to contribute our thoughts about how best to invest in our shared future and to put our bonding authority and capacity to its best use, and to protect our very strong credit ratings. And we aren't passive about that. And finally, did I mention we don't collect taxes? I hear that a lot, so I want to make that clear. So what do? We process the checks. We manage the state's bank accounts. We make sure public funds are protected and invest what is now a $100 billion portfolio between when money arrives and when it's needed to pay bills. By investing for strong performance, we're stretching the budgets of local governments across the state. And our management of the pension fund means that more than $3 billion a year in benefits is paid into the Oregon economy, dollars that circulate as people pay rent and buy groceries and pay their electric bills. We're also the people who actually borrow the money and manage the bonds that pay for new bridges and schools that the legislature approves. The bills get paid, the money is safe and invested well. That matters to all of us. We are, in short, the state's financial steward. But over time, what it means to be a good steward and a good treasury has evolved, and in a way that I believe is positive. We have the vision of some outstanding previous treasurers to thank for that. Yesterday, feels like a long time ago, I was honored to be in San Diego, where the state treasury received a National Excellence and Innovation Award from a leading financial sector magazine known as Pensions and Investments. The recognition was for the several-year development and launch of Oregon Saves, which is our new and first in the nation state-based retirement savings plan for private sector workers. We led the nation and became the first state to launch a state effort to combat the retirement savings crisis. The Financial Times of London, Tom, this is where I get to say something academic for a moment. They wrote a story last year about the savings gap and wrote this, quote, "The future of U.S. retirement provision may not be found in Wall Street, but 3,800 kilometers away in Oregon, a state better known for timber, Nike trainers, and microbreweries." I'll talk more about Oregon Saves after the break, but this recognition is part of a narrative that we've come to expect in Oregon. But we're not afraid to be trailblazers. It's on the jerseys of our NBA team, after all. Our state government has long been seen as a public policy pioneer, inside our borders and from the outside. Consider a few of these examples we are known for and justifiably proud of, although sometimes frustrated by too. The initiative and referendum process, protecting our beaches for public access, the land use system that continues to protect farmland and make cities more livable, the bottle bill, vote by mail, aren't we all glad for that right now? And just recently, increasing voter participation by tying voter registration to driver's licenses. But what most people don't realize is that Oregon has also been seen as a pioneer in the arena of public finance through the state treasury. And let me add an important caveat here. Public finance is not one of those areas generally where you want to have rapid change. Creative really is a good word normally, but not as much if you add accounting after it. So we have to balance these things. But Treasury has indeed evolved. The past 50 years has been what I would call the change era in the world of Oregon public finance. It wasn't always smooth, but today we are far better off financially at the state level and also individually, thanks to the vision and hard work of treasurers who I am fortunate to follow into this esteemed office. So let's take a quick trip down memory lane before we come back to today. Remember, as Tom McCall said, sometimes you want to visit, but please don't stay. The treasurer 50 years ago was a guy named Robert W. Straub. He'd go on to be governor in 1974, and 50 years ago today, in 1968, he was being sued by some friends. He was a former county commissioner and businessman, and Straub was elected treasurer in 1964 by campaigning against the status quo and what he saw as a moribund approach to pension fund investing, not just in Oregon, but everywhere. His campaign slogan summed up that critique: get our money out of the mattress. At his urging, the legislature created in 1967 the Oregon Investment Council and gave it the ability to invest retirement assets in common stock. The expectation was that stock investing, while more risky than the previous approach, would lead to bigger returns and help the pension fund meet its obligations. The law went into effect in 1968 and moved promptly to the courthouse. Because that idea was not without controversy, a friendly constitutional challenge was filed by former Governor Charles Sprague, who used to run the Oregon Statesman newspaper. He was joined by Fred Paulus, the suit against the Oregon Investment Council, including Treasurer Straub. A Marion County judge put the brakes on the law, and the Supreme Court reversed that decision a year later. But the decision to invest in stocks did not mean that the Oregon Treasury was staffing up to it. In those days, there were no computers in the treasurer's office, and we had rotary phones. Remember them? Also, those days, there was still money, actual money, stored in the giant vault at the Capitol. If you ever want to come over and visit our office, the vault is still there, and you can take a look inside. It's now a very secure closet with a very big and thick and heavy door. The investment program was established as an outsourced model, with private sector firms hired to manage the stock investments under the oversight of the council. Longtime U.S. Senator Mark Hatfield, also a Bearcat, by the way, who was governor when Straub was first elected treasurer, didn't always see eye to eye with his colleague who came from the other side of the political aisle. But as Oregon led the way on public investing returns, not just for the pension fund, but also for the state accident insurance fund and other funds, Hatfield was convinced, and he came to refer to Straub as Oregon's Alexander Hamilton. In the years after, Oregon didn't just stop at plain vanilla stock investing. We were one of the first pension funds, public or private, to buy foreign stocks, and one of the first to commit capital to more exotic securities like futures and options. And then came the coup de grace that cemented Oregon's brand as a financial powerhouse in 1981, when the Oregon Pension Fund became the first major pension fund to enter into a leveraged buyout. It was the Fred Meyer sale. It was hugely profitable, and it changed the world of pension investing. And it gave us a first mover advantage that is still paying dividends for Oregon today. Former Treasurer William Rutherford noted in the 1980s that when Oregon made an investment, it was like bestowing a good housekeeping seal of approval. Treasury's focus wasn't only on pension fund assets, although that gets most of the headlines. To help local governments like cities and school districts, Treasury created the Local Government Investment Pool in 1973. Unlike the pension fund, which is invested for beneficiaries, government funds are public funds and can't be invested in stocks. But they don't have to be in the mattress either. By getting stronger returns in the bond market, the goal was to help governments stretch funds between when revenue is received and when money is needed to pay bills. Local governments in Oregon, as you know, rely primarily on property taxes, and they get the bulk of that money once a year. The LGIP, as it's known for short, is part of the short-term fund, and that's also where the state's money is kept. The fund now checks in at about $19 billion of assets under management and is the second largest investment we manage. It consistently beats its benchmarks. And while state agencies have to use this fund, local governments have the choice. Almost all of them choose to invest with us because of the low cost and the performance we generate. At last count, 995 local governments invest with us. The decades from the 1970s to the 1990s were the glory days for the investment program. It came roaring out of the early 1980s recession and was posting huge returns. But that performance increasingly stood in sharp contrast to the economics in rural Oregon, which never fully recovered from the interest rate shocks of the 1980s and the slowdown of the timber industry. The specter of a booming investment fund, accompanied by high jobless rates, created massive political pressure to use pension funds for Oregon economic development and real estate deals. That was compounded as the mistaken belief that pension assets are public funds, a misunderstanding that persists today and one where you can help me. Pension funds are not public dollars. They are owned by current and future retirees. The end result of that pressure and that misunderstanding was a disaster. Local real estate deals were found to be questionable. An investment officer went to jail. And the biggest boondoggle was a pair of hulking airplane hangars at the Portland airport. The pension fund was used to guarantee $50 million in revenue bonds at the Port of Portland, and when the company, PAM Corp, went bust after repairing just 2 airplanes, the fund was left holding the bag. Remember that good housekeeping seal of approval? A little tarnished, perhaps. But 2 decades after Bob Straub, there was another visionary treasurer who came to the rescue and helped Treasury recover from this crisis of confidence. In 1992, voters turned to Jim Hill, who was the first person of color elected to statewide office in Oregon. He was an attorney with an MBA, and he had been attracted to Oregon in the 1970s by the state's progressive politics. He served 2 terms as treasurer, steadying the ship, beating back proposals to dismantle the investment program, and coming up with a responsible answer to the desire to invest in Oregon. Instead of using pension funds, the state created the Oregon Growth Account with a slice of lottery proceeds and with an accompanying mandate that those dollars be used for economic development through venture capital. Also, and very importantly, Treasurer Hill was a respected ambassador with bipartisan appeal. He helped to begin reframing how Treasury interacts with Oregonians. With his support, the legislature approved the creation of the Oregon College Savings Plan in the late 1990s. Previously, Treasury had sold high-denomination bonds as a college savings investment, but the advent of these so-called 529 plans and the very low-cost entry point meant that Treasury was more closely connected to individual Oregon families than ever before. The following decade, as you recall, brought the dot-com bust, the Great Recession, and growing concerns about climate change, and with them, a greater urgency to not just invest, but to invest for both returns and for the values that unite us and go beyond the balance sheet. Now, it's really important to understand something here. As fiduciaries, we are always focused first on investing for the best possible returns. That is the bottom line, and every basis point counts. But as time goes by, we're learning that taking more risk factors into account, like climate change, will lead to strong and sustainable returns. In 2001, Treasurer Randal Edwards was one of the founding members of an organization called INCR, the Investors Network for Climate Risk. He also responded to the local pressure of population growth by expanding the School Bond Guarantee Program, which allows districts to build needed facilities while saving millions of dollars in interest costs. For much of the last 50 years, the role of Treasury had been changing. And then a decade ago, Ben Westland redefined what it means to be treasurer. Ben and I served together in the legislature, and I can say from direct experience knowing him that the only thing bigger than his personality was his heart. He was a folksy Central Oregon rancher with lots of colorful language. He toyed with running for governor as an independent, but instead he was elected treasurer in 2008. Until then, state treasurers had focused their energy and advocacy around issues that directly affected Treasury's business. In other words, investing, bonding, and banking. But Ben looked at his role as treasurer from the big picture and talked about the importance of healthcare as a contributor to our quality of life and an expense that touches the life of every Oregonian. In so doing, he established that treasurers needed to be more than just good stewards of the state's financial resources. They must also be advocates for the financial well-being of every Oregonian. Unfortunately, and very tragically, Ben died just a year after taking office. He was followed into office by Ted Wheeler, who is now having what I'm sure he would describe as a fantastic time being mayor of Portland. We talk sometimes, and I think he has the most difficult job in Oregon politics. Ted's a CEO. He's smart as a whip. He's wired to run things, and he was the right person at the right time as Treasury rebuilt after the economic wreckage of the Great Recession. How bad was it? In one 6-month span, the PERS fund lost a third of its value. It's shocking to think about that still. But Treasury was integral to Oregon's recovery. We borrowed millions for economic stimulus projects that put people to work. We created a multi-state cooperative called the West Coast Infrastructure Exchange to facilitate public-private partnerships. And importantly, we stayed the course on our investments. And we also did not repeat the same mistakes as years before. Despite some pressure, pension assets did not get diverted into local economic development. One of the things that we created to help bring the fund back from the brink was something we call the Opportunity Portfolio, which was the first tactical fund of its type among pension funds. Instead of deliberating for as much as a year before pulling the trigger on a deal, this piece of the portfolio is set up to react very quickly and take advantage of short-term opportunities. So that brings us back to the current day, and I want to recognize what we owe to Bob Straub and Jim Hill, to Randal Edwards, Ben Westlands, and Ted Wheeler. Today, the state treasury is doing more and serving more people directly than ever before. That college savings plan that started in 1999, in less than 20 years, it has grown to more than 100,000 accounts and about $3 billion in assets. The pension fund ranks as one of the best funded in the nation, at 80% funded. More than 73 cents of every dollar in pension benefits comes exclusively from investment returns. That money doesn't need to come from anyplace else, like the state budget. And here's something to keep in mind. Oregon ranks as the 21st largest retirement fund in the industry and in the country, public or private, according to Pensions and Investments. California is admittedly bigger than we are, but our fund is bigger than Ford Motor Company, for example. And outside the investment program, we now handle upwards of $200 billion a year in banking transactions and are safeguarding billions of dollars in public fund deposits. Oregon is moving in the right direction as a financial enterprise. At the same time, the expectations haven't waned for what it means to be a financial leader in Oregon and what it means to be a good institutional investor. More than ever, the Treasury is expected to be a force for good. Last month, I hosted a Sustainable Investing Summit in Portland, which gave us the opportunity for a conversation with Oregon and national leaders about how to manage a portfolio and invest for the long term. In short, we can't lose sight of the traditional dollars and cents. That is our obligation to retirees and to the state. But at the same time, we also need to look beyond the balance sheet. We need our investments to be profitable today, 20 years from now, and beyond. New technology and capacity has allowed us to be more thoughtful about how we invest. For instance, we've moved beyond those rotary phones, and we now have the same sorts of computers they have on Wall Street. So we're moving billions of dollars of investing decisions in-house and paying less for them. Treasury is responsible for the business of government, as I defined it before, but we're also advocating for the financial quality of life for every Oregonian in ways that we touch and also ways that we don't. That's why you're likely to see me working with treasurers from other states to improve financial education, to protect consumers by opposing some of the reckless things we see coming out of the current administration in Washington, like the rollback of the Fiduciary Rule. And one more thing, we're also looking ahead at Treasury. One of the biggest challenges that's looming is the loss of brain power and institutional memory that we, like many other employers, are facing. At that same time, it's getting increasingly hard to find talented newcomers with financial acumen. When we talk to young people who are going into the field of business nowadays, few of them realize how big of a business government has become. We move billions of dollars, and our staff sometimes feels like they are millions of years old. Don't tell them I said that, it's a joke. But we need to recognize that an awful lot of talent is nearing retirement age. We need promising young minds from a diversity of backgrounds and perspectives to come to Treasury and to government. If we are to have the same success in the next 50 years, we'll need new injections of youth and energy and financial expertise and the right amount of creativity. Those are all things that helped get us here. A year ago this week, we unveiled a new fellowship program, and we're recruiting nationally to help bring the best and brightest public finance students to Oregon. It was not at all hard to come up with a name for this program. We're calling them the Robert Straub Fellowships. The first summer fellow came from Willamette, and I'm happy to say he was great. So I feel like this is a decent time to take a break. I'm happy to answer any questions or ideas you might have now. Then, if I understand the format correctly, we'll take a break and come back for a second half. I see the first hand up. Yes, please. It's you, right in the front here. Oh, there's a microphone coming. Okay, got it. We want everyone else here.
I'm losing everything here, sorry.
No problem.
So my name is Franca, and I want to go back to the beginning of your presentation with regards to Governor Straub and his plan to invest, and that was challenged in court. And the Supreme Court supported his plan. Mm-hmm. So can you explain what was their basis for supporting it?
Yeah, I think there are two elements that were really important to his plan. One was the creation of the council itself, so that it was not simply one person. Some of my colleagues, the Treasurer of North Carolina, the Comptroller of the State of New York, for example, are sole fiduciaries. So all those decisions are up to that one person. And I think we are much better off having a group of people making that decision, so we are less subject to a bad idea from any one person. So the Investment Council is the Treasurer and 4 other people who are nominated by the Governor and confirmed by the Senate. The basis of the challenge was that the Constitution says the state cannot hold equity. But the resolution was that in this case, it's not the state's money, it's retirees' money. So that is what allows us to invest those dollars in equity on behalf of retirees. And I think it's safe to say that if that were not the case, our pension situation would be much, much worse, because we have the wherewithal, the talent, the expertise to make really good decisions and take advantage of where markets are going. That's a big part of our effort, and that's the nature of the suit. Does that help? Yes. Right.
Good morning.
Good morning.
My name's Joel.
Hi, Joel.
And many, many years ago, I belonged to an investment club, and we had a representative from your office come, and he made the point that we were moving at that point from a lumber industry economy to a service economy. We didn't believe it, you know. The point being that there are changes and transitions. As a demographic, we're not representative. We've got a liberal group here mostly, and people that have wisdom and vision, and we know there's change, but we need to embrace change and always be ready. My question is, though, how viable is the PERS account? We hear such war stories about it not being able to fund in the future.
Thank you. I'm glad to talk about this because I think there are a lot of misconceptions about it. It is always an issue. It always has a budget impact, but people need to realize where we are in our state. We are much better funded than lots of other states. I could name a bunch of states without thinking about it who would love to switch places with us. And that is a result of two things, I think. Some of the policymakers who were around in 1996 and 2003 who made significant changes that essentially ended the piece of the system that has created most of our problem. It is that we're not adding to that, essentially. So the bulk of what's known as the unfunded liability is associated with Tier 1, and that hasn't existed for anyone who was hired after 1996. So even if we did nothing, the bulk of that problem will eventually go away. The question for us is how to deal with the budget impact in the short run. And we have, in contrast with some other states, we've not played games with our contributions. We don't take pension holidays, and as a result, rating agencies point to our system as a strength. The implication of that is that it sets up pension contributions against other things that we care a lot about, notably schools. And so there is, if we're to deal with that budget impact, I think it will require contributions from everybody. And as treasurer, what I think people have to realize that our first job is to generate returns. The last thing you'd want is a treasurer with his or her eye off the ball and making the problem worse. So we always want to focus there. And we resist, or I resist, the temptation that I see a lot when people want us to wade into those policy matters, and mostly they're trying to position us. They're saying, see, this is a great idea, and you have to agree with us publicly, or that's terrible, and you have to condemn it. No, I have to make money for the retirement system. If the field is wide open, I have some ideas that we could talk about, but mostly we have to make sure that we're generating returns. And one other thing that I want to, well, two other things, I suppose. I could keep going for a while. When you hear people talk about the $22 billion unfunded liability, I want you to keep something in mind. I'm guessing that many of you have or had a mortgage at some point in your life. The question is, if someone came to you and said, could you pay off your mortgage in cash today? For most people, the answer is no. But the answer also, I think, is no if that question is followed up by saying, does that mean that you can't eat, that you can't have clothes, you can't live your life? The answer is no. That mortgage is something you manage, you monitor, you factor it in when you make other financial decisions, and in some sense, that's what the unfunded liability is. The good news is we don't have to pay it all off in cash today. We manage it over time. So that's important. And lastly, with 14 days to go before Election Day, I would just advise everyone here to be very wary of any candidates who have secret PERS plans. This is a place where details matter, and it has big implications. So be appropriately skeptical on those ideas. Thanks for a good question.
Hi, my name is Terry, and my
There you
question
are. Thank you.
is
You're sitting
about
down. I got you now.
the 529 plan, as
Yes.
you know, was recently converted to a new provider.
Yes.
So I wanted to provide some feedback as well as get your perspective on lessons learned from that.
Yeah.
I've been a customer for 15 years, and
Thank you.
during that transition, one of my beneficiary accounts seemingly was closed. Even though we had used it recently, I think that happened because there was no money currently in the account. But as you know, people regularly transfer money between beneficiaries.
Yes.
So I'm just interested in, and I know there were other issues as well as there is in any kind of transition, and I was wondering what kind of lessons learned you guys have with the 529 plan.
Thank you for bringing that up. We'll talk more about the plan generally in the second half, but first off, has the issue been solved? Can we, do we need, okay, so we need to follow up afterwards. I'll get your card and we'll close that loop. Yeah, any kind of a transition of this magnitude is bound to have some bumps, and we certainly don't minimize that. We really wanted to move from TIA to Bank of New York someday because of the improved flexibility, the improved technology, the improved ways that we're going to be able to interact with people who are saving. And the good news is $1.5 billion, I think it was at the end, we came out $1.22 ahead, moving more than $1.5 billion across. So we're very happy about that. Not so happy about the cases like yours where things didn't go perfectly smoothly, but we're working really hard to close those up. I think one of the lessons is just how hard this is. in order to get everything lined up, we had to coordinate amongst essentially 4 entities to find the calendar when they could do it in a weekend, essentially, that we tried to find a place where there was historically less activity. So we hit what we hoped was a balance between after public universities had their bills due before public universities and after private universities. But there's no ideal way to do it. Hopefully, we won't do this again for a very long time. We're happy with what Bank of New York is offering us and all of our savers. So I can certainly follow up more with you about that if that's helpful. Thanks.
This is Don.
There you are.
You alluded at one point to the proposed rollback of the Fiduciary Rule,
Yes.
presumably by the Trump administration. I haven't read about that. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So during the Obama administration, the rule was promulgated that essentially said anyone who's managing your money needs to act as a fiduciary, to act in your interest, not as a salesperson, just selling. And the Trump administration, through various mechanisms and means, has attempted to delay and roll that back. The good news, I think, is that many financial institutions had already begun their efforts to comply with that rule and essentially said, we're just going to comply with it anyway. But fundamentally, if you're a person who's seeking investment advice, it doesn't make any sense to me that you would have to think, now this person is not actually giving me advice that's in my interest. They're trying to sell me something. Of course, everyone has to be somewhat skeptical and wary, but to say as a country, if you are presenting yourself as a financial advisor, you ought to actually live up to that. To act in the interests of those you're serving does not seem to me to be a stretch. I think, when I was in the legislature, most of the time I could, at least intellectually, thanks to my training here at Willamette, construct the argument that the other side had and try to appreciate it. But this one, I don't think there is a reasonable argument to be made on the other side. You should act in the interests of the people that you're serving. Yes, please.
I'm also Don.
Hi, Don.
Back in the late 70s and during the 80s, I was a lead contract negotiator for the faculty at a community college. Inflation was very high, and at some point, you can probably tell me what year happened, was other public groups were getting about a 6% increase in wages just because inflation was really high. And someone came up with the idea of, well, it helps the employer and us if we just pick up your contribution to the PERS system.
Yeah.
Well, hindsight, looking back, it probably did work out fine for everyone, but now we have the impression that employees didn't contribute to their and so what they did did not take a 6% increase, but instead took an alternative route. So this image, I think we still live with that. Is that true?
I think your description is accurate, and there are a lot of places where the policy and the politics intersect and interact, and this is a prime example of that. It's frustrating sometimes, and you may have heard a little bit of that in my previous answer around the PERS question, where there are a lot of misimpressions and strong feelings that kind of insinuate themselves into the discussion. And I think educated groups like this one have both an opportunity and I might even suggest a responsibility to try to inject that history and that perspective and that reality. There's plenty of opportunity for us, even when you're in the line at the grocery store and you hear somebody saying something that not to be true. You don't have to agree, but it's Oregon, so try to be polite and help people understand. Well, I don't think that's actually quite true, and here's another thing you should keep in mind. I think we have a lot of work to do to get better at disagreeing with each other in a productive and helpful way. Too often these days we just quietly grumble about it and go back to our social media and our preferred cable outlet and just hear what we want. But it's really important that we take into account those alternative perspectives and try to get to a place where we can at least as Moynihan said, everyone's entitled to their own opinions, but no one's entitled to their own facts. So let's keep that in mind too. Is this a good time to stop for our break? I'm looking at you, Tom. Two? Okay, keep going. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, that's fine.
Hi, good morning. This is Cassia.
Morning.
I recently sat through a very long presentation by the city, Salem,
I'm glad you said it was theirs that was really long and not mine.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
at which they discussed their PERS situation pretty extensively.
Yeah.
And, the city is part of the overall state PERS system. And their financial officer made the point very clearly that right now the city is only covering 69% through its PERS fund. And you just indicated a moment ago that the PERS fund overall is capable of covering 73% of the current retirees and benefits. What accounts for that gap? And also, what's the actual relationship between the city and the PERS and the state PERS fund, so that I can get a better understanding of how all that works?
So it's time for the break, right? There's a bunch of stuff in your question, and I'll start with clarifying what I said. So our funded status as a whole is around 80%. So that is a measure of what we could pay if we had to pay it all off in cash today. The 73 cents was the percentage of benefits that are paid out each year that come from our investment returns. So when we generate money by investment, it doesn't have to come from the budget. So that was meant to underscore how important our performance is. The relationship between local employers is a function of the decisions they've made as to who and how they hire. It's a function of their population, how many retirees they have, how big their staff is. So every local employer has a slightly different situation. Some local employers have also done things like establishing side accounts. Portland Community College is reportedly considering something called a pension obligation bond, which I think is a really dangerous thing potentially. But the point is that each one has a different setup in a different situation. So we, with that large number of local employers, our focus is to try to do the best we can for the system as a whole. And Oregon, unlike some other states, has a separate system where we deal with assets but not liabilities. So the PERS system, the administration, they have a separate board. They set the assumed rate, for example. We're continuing to focus on the investment side. But I think I couldn't speak to what number you heard them say. My guess is that it might be a slightly different version of that, and I'd probably have to know more to say something more about it, but maybe we can follow up during the break. Thanks. Okay.
Yeah, my name's Phil.
Hi, Phil.
By the way, young man, you are a dead ringer.
Here it comes.
For Peyton Manning, boy, I'll tell you.
I was once chased around Memphis. In
Well,
fact, I went to Memphis in 1997 for the national championship game, football in NAIA, with the Bearcats. And I was chased around Memphis by some people who thought I was Peyton Manning. It's true.
And your next job, you could take over for him in commercials.
Maybe we could contribute some of those dollars to the PERS fund.
Well, I've got a hypothetical what if.
This is what politicians love, yes.
And I've, coming from a state that has sales tax, I can see how much it helps a budget. Now, I know it's extremely unpopular in Oregon, because of the property taxes. So, would let's say a 7-8% sales tax, I'm dreaming here, how would that impact your budget? And would it help you? And blah blah blah. I appreciate a comment.
I can answer this question in 2 words. It depends. To expand on that a little bit, I generally think that our revenue stream should not be thought of any differently than our investment strategy. We should be diversified, and there are disadvantages and advantages to every general platform for taxes. We are more dependent on the income tax as a single source than any other state on any other source, and it has some issues. We also have what one of my predecessors called, well, he said there's dumb, there's dumber, and then he followed it up, which you can probably guess, there's the kicker. No other state has the kicker. This audience probably doesn't need an explanation about that. I do think we should think about tax reform fundamentally, and keep in mind that third piece doesn't necessarily have to be a sales tax. A consumption tax of some sort makes a lot of sense, and you could do it in a way. We used to have these conversations all the time when I was a legislator. Imagine, we just became a state yesterday, and we need a tax structure to pay for things we all want. Is there anybody in the room who wants to raise their hand to defend the tax structure we now have as the ideal? Okay, it's been more than 12 years. Not a single person has ever raised their hand. So we have unanimity on this. We need to make a change. It breaks down a little bit after that. But we can say to people, look, we have a system that would not require Oregonians who are currently paying taxes to pay any new taxes, and yet would generate significant new funds by taxing tourism and the cash economy. And so I think we always have to continue to have that discussion. The joke, of course, is that Oregon likes to be first or last and nothing in between. And now we're down to like 5 states that don't have a sales tax. And you will also, I'll give you one other piece of evidence or something to respond to when you have this conversation, because I'm guessing based on your confidence in this, you might have this conversation with your family and so on. You're likely to hear, yeah, well, Oregon has voted 9 times against the sales tax. And here's your retort. Well, the last time that we had that vote was before the internet, and it took 5 times for Oregon to get it right at statewide votes and allow women to vote. So sometimes it's okay to have this question asked more than once.
Tobias, I think it's pretty bold of you to even raise the possibility of tax reform. And of course you do remember the story of Al Ullman.
Generally, but please.
Well, who argued for a value-added tax, which is kind of like a sales tax. And he was chairman of House Ways and Means at the federal level. He represented this district, and he got tossed on his ear. Of course, he was running in the year that Reagan took the whole
1980.
whole thing. Well, based on your first hour, Tobias, I'm sure we're all looking forward to the second hour as well.
It'll be fun.
Let's take a 10-minute break.
Welcome back. Thank you for sticking around. Not too many people seem to have escaped. So I think we'll pick it back up. And I really appreciated the questions that we had before the break, and I hope you'll have more of those. When I worked at Nike, every morning shoes ran through my brain unexpectedly. But these days I think a lot more about money. And I still find it amazing that when the buck stops, I'm responsible for the management of billions of dollars of other people's money. Makes me start my routine a little bit differently. Costco sells giant bottles of antacid, but I'm kidding. My routine these days involves certainly being really thankful for all of the expertise at Treasury. And when I talk about Treasury as a powerhouse financial enterprise, I'm really talking about people. It's a diverse collection of about 150 talented professionals that do this work to make sure Treasury works. Think about that. Billions and billions of dollars and 150 people. That's a big responsibility, and they are doing it really remarkably well. It makes me feel better in the morning and when I go to sleep. One of the most rewarding aspects for me of becoming treasurer was that I've been fortunate to join and lead one of the best organizations in Oregon state government. I can't say enough good things about their professionalism, their expertise, and their spirit of public service. Over the past 2 years, we haven't just been crunching numbers together. We've gone to clean beaches together, to pack food boxes at the Marion Polk Food Share and the Portland Food Bank, and to raise money for a number of other community causes. Chances are you might even know a Treasury employee in your daily life, and you may not even be aware of it. They're like financial superheroes protecting our money while living incognito among us. Kind of like the Justice League, but less spandex and more MBAs. Another thing I think about in the morning that I didn't used to as much is risk. It's everywhere. currency trading risk, volatility risk, geopolitical risk, climate risk. We could go on for a long time. Risk, of course, doesn't automatically mean danger, and in business and investing, risk is rewarded. So one of our chief jobs is to embrace and manage that risk in order to make money. So as we think about the future, the answer is not that you need to avoid risks. Rather, it's that we need to take the right risks at the right time and with the best information that we can get our hands and our brains on. At Treasury, one of our competitive advantages is that we work hard to secure information and data for our benefit and for yours. Here's an example. One of our chief responsibilities is selling bonds, and we sell them in chunks, hundreds of millions of dollars at a time. We map out those sales ahead of time, and of course, therefore, a litany of purposes. We finance roads, schools, projects to make buildings more sturdy so they can survive earthquakes. Next spring, we'll sell $100 million to help protect the Elliott State Forest near Coos Bay, and you can buy some. Another reason we sell bonds is to refinance other bonds. Investors will buy municipal bonds for a set minimum period of time, and after that time elapses, we can look for opportunities to resell a new batch of bonds at lower interest rates and save Oregon taxpayers money. In the last 6 years alone, Treasury has saved taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars this way. But it's not a slam dunk. There are a lot of risks that go into that calculus. For instance, what's happening with interest rates? What's going to happen with interest rates? How is Oregon's credit rating? What if a whole bunch of other governments sell municipal bonds at exactly the same time and it floods the market? If that happens, you compete with other sellers, and it means you could have to pay more to investors and reduce the long-term savings you're after. So how do you manage all that risk? One thing we've done at Treasury is to create a centralized bond calendar so we can track and help stage not just state bond sales, but also those of every other public and semi-public entity in Oregon. The moral of this story is clear. You can't erase all risk, but there are some smart things we can do to mitigate it. And in some cases, we can even capitalize on it. When I first took my oath as treasurer, I laid out 3 overarching priorities. First was to always invest for the long term and employ long-run thinking as we make decisions. That means we should be willing to roll up our sleeves and address challenges that, if ignored, will impact all Oregonians. Crumbling roads and bridges, aging pipes, unsafe and inadequate school facilities, an environment and an economy threatened by global climate change. These challenges all require long-term thinking, and they defy soundbite solutions. Second, I said we're going to try to do business the right way. In addition to setting the tone for prudent fiscal leadership, State Treasury is a critical business enterprise, as we've already talked about. The health and capacity of our Treasury determines how much we can accomplish as a state. Managing the state's central bank is not usually a hot topic, and it shouldn't be. And third, we'll help Oregonians invest in themselves. Here in Oregon, as we all know, we're an independent bunch with a pioneering spirit, but we also want to think ahead. And as state treasurer, I work to make it easier for people to save and invest for their own futures and for those of their children and grandchildren. Now, the idea that we ought to help the public to do much of anything is not without its critics. We are state government, after all, and there is a persistent notion out there that government has not the Midas touch, but the minus touch. As in, everything that government touches, government ruins. And the corollary, which is that government works best when government gets out of the way. It's a funny bumper sticker. I'm sure we've all seen it, and you'll hear it a lot these days in the midst of campaign season, and from people who probably ought to reconsider the amount of time they spend on Twitter. But at the end of the day, I think that idea is flat wrong. There are some things, absolutely, that business and free enterprise should do. They do them exceptionally well. But at the same time, there are a lot of essential public priorities that just won't happen without being shepherded by an effective government. I'm sure we could all offer a number of examples, but here are a few. Protecting clean water, ensuring high-quality public education, financing public transportation, and keeping health care affordable. Those things don't happen on their own, and government plays an important convening role. It can step in to create incentives for things we want. Explains why there is a mortgage interest tax deduction, for example, to help motivate more home ownership. At Treasury, we are working to provide several ways to help Oregonians invest in themselves and their loved ones. All of them are helping not only families, but advancing key public goals. We want people to save for themselves, for college education, vocational training, for disability-related costs, and for retirement. It's good for them, and it's good for the state. I was talking about risks a moment ago. One of the biggest risks facing us, both as families and as a state, is the risk that too many people aren't doing enough or anything at all. So I want you to think for a moment about an important number, or rather a non-number, 0. Everyone understands that concept. And for more than half of people who are working in Oregon, that is the amount of money they have saved for retirement, 0. Same goes for education saving, and I know that's not true in this room, but the majority of families have saved 0 for higher education. Let's think of another way we could apply 0. How about the odds that the cost of retirement or college educations are going to get less expensive or anytime soon? Those statistics, I think, loom really large as we think about where your state treasury is now and where we're headed. The risk of doing nothing is too great. Helen Keller once said that avoiding danger is no safer in the long run than outright exposure. So we're not thinking just about the risks that are inherent in our lines of business, but increasingly we're thinking more about the risks to every Oregonian due to an epidemic lack of financial preparedness. Money is vital to everything we do. So are people. In the years ahead, I predict that Treasury will play an increasingly important role in the financial lives of Oregonians because your financial security and your quality of life are connected, like it or not. To offer more needed help to Oregonians, we are reimagining what a state treasury of the future should look like from top to bottom. That means expanding the tools that the Treasury makes available to help families. It means finding new and innovative ways to help Oregonians build better lives. And in addition, it means building new relationships and making sure that we are reaching every Oregonian in every geographic and demographic corner of the state. State government agencies are required to do business with us, so we don't have to do as much to convince them, but we do continue to strive for exemplary customer service. But for everybody else, we need to make the case that investing in yourself is the right thing to do now and in the future, and we can help. So what will this evolving Treasury look like? My goal is to become a more customer service focused enterprise and to connect with more people in the form of those programs that we offer. Those zeros I referenced earlier are not going to fix themselves. Before the break, we were talking about how Oregon is widely regarded as a financial pioneer, especially over the last 50 years. Before the 1990s, Treasury interacted almost exclusively with financial institutions and government entities, the customers that we served. In the 1990s, we already talked about Oregon selling what were then called baccalaureate bonds as a way for people to save for college. It was a way that was effective, but largely for higher net worth people to save. And it was also fairly popular. Over the life of the program, Treasury sold almost $200 million worth of those bonds. But the Oregon College Savings Plan, which is, I know, a topic of much interest amongst this group, was a sea change. When it was passed in the 1990s, it made it easier to save and to save on taxes. Now, in this room, we have a very well-informed group who refers to 529s, but you will not hear me, unless I make a mistake, refer to them as 529 plans. You all know this. You know that it refers to the section of the IRS code where they are located, but almost nobody outside of this room knows that. So I have tried to ban myself from using that number. And I hereby give you permission to glare at me, throw something at me, kick me if I say that. I would much rather call them college savings plans. But even that is not exactly right. Everyone in this room knows the truth, but I think a lot of other people, when they hear college savings plan, even if I avoid saying 529, because we don't have 529 of them, by the way, we have hundreds of thousands, but one plan. I think many people think that these plans and these accounts are only good for four-year institutions. And you all know that's not true. They're equally important and applicable at community colleges, vocational and trade schools, culinary school. Anything that is eligible for financial aid from the federal government is eligible for college savings plans. So we need to send that message as well. Almost every state offers a college savings plan, but the tax treatment is different state by state. In Oregon, I'm sure many of you know, the law allows you to deduct the money you put into those accounts from your income, about $4,600 a year. All that invested money grows tax-free as long as it's used for qualified education expenses, but beyond just tuition, anything that's required for attendance, so room and board, transportation, books, computers, just to name a few. And the launch of that plan was a pivot for what it means to be a state treasury today. Instead of talking to people carrying briefcases and wearing expensive suits, it means talking to every Oregonian about investing in their own future. And all of you know, I'm sure, you can open a college savings account with just $25. That's accessible savings, and we want to make sure people know about it. Today, almost 20 years after it began, the college savings plan is a major financial success, at least in terms of the assets invested. As I mentioned earlier, Oregonians are collectively saving about $3 billion for higher education. And it's been a generation, and children whose parents started saving with the advent of the program are now college age. Higher education is certainly getting more expensive, so it seems like a no-brainer to save for it. And as a state, it is a no-brainer to create incentives that will lead to more college degrees and a more highly skilled workforce. Our goal in Oregon is to compete on the global stage and to win. And you can't do that without talent. And here's a study that I want you to keep in mind as you help spread the word about college savings plans. If a child has a college savings account in her name, she is 3 times as likely to go to college. She is 4 times as likely to graduate from college. And both of these things are true regardless of how much is in the account. Just having that account creates the motivation. That's Washington University of St. Louis, Willie Elliott, for you economists down here. That's the citation. So now, after heaping all this praise on the program, I'm going to throw you a curve. We are not doing enough. As well as we've done with the Oregon College Savings Plan, we are not living up to its promise. And while the plan makes it easy for everybody to save, the trouble is when you look at who is using it, it's not everybody. Thus far, the plan has been predominantly used by middle and upper income Oregonians. Don't get me wrong, we're not complaining about people using it. We want people to save, and with more assets under management, we're able to cut fees for everybody. When you crunch the numbers, we found that the rate of saving plummets when you get to underserved and underrepresented communities, rural counties and communities of color, for example. That's why at Treasury we are increasing our efforts to connect these tools with families that need a little extra encouragement to save and prepare for the future. How are we doing this? One new program is called Be College Ready, bringing us directly to elementary schools where we are handing out school supplies and doing workshops. And we recently added a new engagement director and coordinator who will be focusing on reaching families we haven't done a good job of connecting with, including families who speak other languages. We're also working to make sure that more people know that anybody, again, something everyone in this room knows, anybody can open and add to an account, grandparents included. And this is new. Another place you can help us spread the word. We're reaching out to new parents with a baby grad program. Open an account before a child's first birthday, and we will seed it with $25. Get that account opened, please, before that first birthday. It's important because, as we all know, the longer you save, the better. Second, we want people to invest, but they need to know about it. They need to trust it, and that means they need to understand it. So we're changing our website. As we've already talked about a little bit, we've transitioned to a new college savings plan program manager who will help us do a better job reaching more people more simply. And looking ahead to the next legislative session, we're exploring the potential of changing how the income tax benefit works. Right now, it's a deduction that lowers your taxable income. And for people with more income, it makes sense. So we're asking the question, what if we add a credit against the income taxes that you owe and scale it so that lower income people could even get money back if they contribute? We're asking for all the analysis to confirm that allowing lower income Oregonians to actually offset the money that they put into college savings may not cost much more to the state. And as we discussed, the value would certainly be very high in terms of people getting education and training beyond high school. I was talking to a friend of mine earlier this month who happens to be the lieutenant governor in Washington State. He said something really profound. He said the world is really good at telling us what we're good for. So what we're trying to do is help everybody understand that they are good enough to go beyond high school. We know that even if you have a small balance, you're more likely to attend and graduate, and that is a great return on investment. We want people who are saving to keep saving, but that, I think, is the low-hanging fruit. How we can get more people to get started is really important. More saving is better than less, and more higher education and job training is better than less. With the changes we have in mind and those that are already in the pipeline, I'm confident we're going to see more saving and more opportunity for more people. People that reflect the diversity of Oregon, of our shared future, and of our promise. So up until a few years ago, when we talked about investing in yourself at Treasury, the college savings plan was it. That has also changed, and in a good way. In 2014, Congress authorized a new sort of plan that would follow the same rules, more or less, of the college savings plan, but the money saved could be used for the costs for people with disabilities. And in 2016, while I was in the legislature, we passed the enabling bill, and by the end of the year, Oregon became one of the first states to offer a plan. We call it the Oregon ABLE Savings Plan. ABLE, because we do this in government, is an acronym, Achieving a Better Life Experience. That's the name of the federal bill as well. But because not every state has a plan, Treasury has also created a national version, which we call ABLE for All. We all know people with disabilities and their families face a lot of more significant challenges in their lives. But prior to the development of these ABLE plans, it was even worse because people were actually penalized for saving. The way laws were written, people were functionally forced to live in poverty if they wanted to remain eligible for vital means-tested benefits like Medicaid and supplemental Social Security income. It's because those programs required the individual to have less than $2,000 in savings and investments in order to qualify. So the public policy goal of ABLE was pretty straightforward. Money contributed to an ABLE account does not count against any asset limits for state and federal benefits. Like college savings plans, those who receive the Oregon ABLE Savings Plan, Oregonians will receive several tax advantages, including a state income tax deduction and tax-free earnings on investments that are spent on disability-related expenses. And that's a pretty wide range: housing, education, transportation, medical bills, and more. As of this month, in a relatively short period of time, the Oregon ABLE plan has accumulated a grand total of 1,523 accounts and total combined savings of $6.5 million. When you add the national plan, the total savings figure climbs to $8.3 million. And it's important to think about these numbers in a different context, unlike college savings plans, which accumulate over a long period of time and then are drawn down in bigger chunks. These are accounts that people are using all the time. So dollars are coming in and out on a much more frequent basis. I'm proud of this program, though. I'm proud that we created a platform that's a national model that's allowing other states to take part of it. And because of the other innovative features we've added, like our debit card interface that's worked so well, we've been able to earn some national recognition for our partnership with Lyft. In addition, our expertise as a national leader is helping other states to get their plans off the ground. It's helping Oregon as a result, too. We've made the behind-the-scenes architecture, the technology and the platform available, and as of now, Washington is using it, and other states, including Connecticut, are negotiating. So we're making that available to other states. With these extra assets, we're able to achieve savings through economies of scale, which means we're able to offer the plan to Oregon families for even less. And now, as with the Oregon College Savings Plan, we're focused on improving public outreach so everybody who is eligible knows about Oregon Able. It's a great program, and I think we should all be proud of it. One of the common refrains we hear in both the legislature and at Treasury is the question of how people can invest in Oregon. The College Savings Plan and Oregon Able are targeted investments under federal tax law, and they're terrific options if you're saving for college or disability-related expenses. But what if you're not? Every year, as I mentioned earlier, we sell multi-million-dollar blocks of government bonds. And for every bond sale, we let the public in line first, before opening it up to the major institutional investors like Fidelity and Vanguard. Bond investing is certainly not for everybody, and I am not here as your financial advisor. But when it does make sense, we're proud that we can make it possible to invest in Oregon infrastructure and other projects. This year, for the first time, we sold a batch of Oregon sustainability bonds, which were for affordable housing projects. And we're pleased that the demand far exceeded the supply. It helped set the foundation for our second sustainability bond sale, which will be in early 2019. In that sale, Oregonians will be able to buy bonds, and again, you can if you want, to help save the Elliott State Forest near Coos Bay while also earning a rate of return. This is part of a plan that we advanced in the Land Board and the legislature to move the forest out of the Common School Fund. We're certainly excited about this sale, and we're going to begin publicizing it later this year, so more Oregonians will know about what I think is an exciting opportunity to invest in the state. At the beginning of the conversation today, I talked about how I was in San Diego yesterday. Not long enough to hit the beach, but long enough to accept an award for Oregon's national leadership in the arena of retirement saving. And so I want to return to that for a moment. When we look back in the history of Oregon's trailblazing policies, all those ones that we talked about, I'm increasingly convinced that Oregon Saves might be on this list, and for good reason. Nationally, the retirement savings crisis is massive and growing. The gap between what's needed and what's actually saved is estimated to be no less than $6.8 trillion, according to the National Institute for Retirement Security. It's a huge risk and certainly unsustainable. That gap is more than just a number. It represents a wave of coming poverty that threatens to swamp families and will place huge new demands on state government. From studies, we know a few things. More than half of workers have saved nothing. The average savings isn't even enough to pay the rent for 1 year in most Oregon cities. At the same time, people are 15 times more likely to save if they have the option to do so at work. And as of the beginning of 2017, more than 1 million Oregonian workers don't have a savings option at work. The answer that Oregonians came up with is Oregon Saves. It's a public-private partnership that's administered by the state treasury and makes available an automatic enrollment IRA to workers if an employer does not offer them one. It's a nice bit of symmetry for me because as a legislator, I was chief sponsor of the bill that put Oregon Saves into motion, one of the last major pieces of legislation I got to work on. And as treasurer, I've got the responsibility to roll it out and implement it. Along the way, that has also involved fighting the Trump administration's really strange preoccupation with making it harder for low-income people to save their own money. Here's how Oregon Saves works. If you are a business and for whatever reason you don't offer a retirement plan to your workers, then you sign them up. They can opt out if they want, but at this point, most people are staying in, about 3 of every 4 people. If you're a worker, at each paycheck, a small amount of your own pay will go into your own IRA, your retirement account. It's not PERS, it's a private IRA with funds that are managed by State Street Global Advisors. But because it's an IRA, it's portable, and you can take it from job to job, putting money in it as you want, and it will always be your money, your account. We began it with a pilot project last summer, rolling it out now in deliberate steps statewide. Because it involves working with employers and to facilitate access, we decided to start it in phases. We want it to be easy for everybody. As of this month, we're closing in on $8.5 million saved in these accounts. Most of that from people who have never saved a dime before. That's exciting. And we know that from early demographic data that savers are likely to be younger, which means we're laying a foundation for a long-term culture shift in which saving becomes the norm. And I'm especially excited to see the enthusiasm from businesses. We all know that in the long run, more savings will be better for them because it's making them more competitive for job seekers, and it also addresses one of the highest sources of employee issues, financial stress. I love hearing the stories from individual people who are saving. Steph Whiteside works at Nature's Pet Store here in Salem, and she says, it's really helped me to establish a way to save funds for my future, and it was so easy to do. We've all got a stake in programs like this because in the long run, more savings from people like Steph will ultimately raise their standards of living, give them more choices, and reduce the strain on our already strained social safety net. One recent study showed that even modest savings in a plan like Oregon Saves will allow workers to delay when they start getting their Social Security checks, and that means the checks will be bigger. And at the same time, less demand for Oregon government services is projected to save tens of millions of dollars, according to a recent study from AARP. So we're looking forward. We're not just making room in our trophy case and congratulating ourselves. We're working hard to make sure that businesses statewide are ready and that workers know about Oregon Saves. We're a small business state, and the biggest waves of workers have not yet enrolled. But researchers across the country are watching too, and other states, including Illinois and California, and Maryland, and Connecticut, are preparing to launch their own versions of Oregon Saves. They call them Secure Choice. The federal government, sadly, is not helping us here, and we know that states are the ones that have to take the lead. We expect this is going to continue to work, and as it does, based on what we've seen this far, we will see billions of dollars invested by people who aren't saving today. Over time, Oregon Saves will be a boon for workers, businesses, taxpayers, and the long-term economy. And it continues the tradition of Treasury working to make Oregon lives better. Going first was a risk, but we believe it's a risk that's going to pay off. One final thought for today, and then I want to hear your questions. Things are a little frayed right now, this backdrop of intensity and negativity that we confront. Often things don't feel friendly as we close in on Election Day, and people seldom embrace government lovingly. That's nothing especially new. But I'm reminded of something Will Rogers said a century ago. He, of course, made a living poking fun at government with lines like this. Last year we said things can't go on like this, and they didn't. They got worse. But whether you're a Democrat or a Republican or a non-affiliated voter or an independent or something else, I think we can all agree tension is way up and that trust is way down. People are down on government. And we have to remember that government isn't really a thing per se. It's us. It's by the people, for the people, by the people, for the people, and of the people, or at least it should be. And I think it exists to meet our needs and help us prepare for the future that we will face together, whether we like that or not. When it comes together in positive ways, some of which I hope I've shared today, we can achieve results that are really innovative and make lives better. Sometimes I talk about my time here at Willamette when I was on the crew. It's a great metaphor for how much better things can work when we row together instead of whacking each other with oars. And right now, I'd argue that we are not moving very quickly at all because there aren't enough people in the boat. More people in the boat rowing and rowing together will help us make faster progress. So I think the better answer to our challenges is a bigger boat, more voices, especially younger ones, and of course, less clashing of oars. There's always room for debate, and we can always look for things to improve, but I think it's time to start celebrating our shared successes as they happen, instead of playing a blame game that tears us all down. I mentioned that bumper sticker about government getting out of the way. It's still wrong. I think government works best when we all understand that we are all part of the solution and when we roll out the welcome mat. We have problems that are begging for the right answers, but we can answer them. It's up to all of us. So let's all get in the boat and start rowing. Thank you all for being here and letting me be part of it. I'm interested in your questions, please. And now I know just to follow the microphone rather than to call on someone.
Jinx here in the back row.
Hi.
This is probably just my bent, but I get really nervous about votes where we're going to change the Constitution and embed things permanently forever till we, anyway, I worry about that. So could you explain to me, I am not following the rationale of 103. Could you explain it?
You want me to advocate for an idea that I think is bad?
Just wanted your opinion.
Yes, no, I will. So I think you enter the question with exactly the right frame of mind. In my view, the Constitution is the place where we should more often say we always do this or we never do that, and not do a lot of policy in the Constitution. I think the argument, and this I'm forgetting 103 and 104. 103 is groceries, correct? Okay. So I think, and now I've taken off my treasurer hat and just put on my elected person with an opinion hat, I think this is residual from the big fight that occurred in 2016 around Measure 97 and the gross receipts tax. And my own view is that both of those are going to make the kind of comprehensive revenue reform that we need more difficult. There are a lot of things that are funky and not correctly written in that measure. So in addition to what I would say is a reason to vote against it on its face, I think if it were to pass, the implementation would be problematic for a lot of other things. But fundamentally, I think it's just a reaction to discussions around comprehensive tax reform. Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
Roger here.
Hi, Roger.
And I realize, of course, that you don't deal with taxes.
I have opinions, though, so that's okay.
But you have all these wonderful bond plans. And when I think of taxes, I think of a remark somebody made 40 or 50 years ago that we need to stop taxing things we want, like money, and instead tax things we don't want, like garbage. And I've heard about a lot of bonds, but I've yet to hear you mention a bond for something like people who want to save to make a big investment in some kind of energy efficiency or garbage reduction. Is that sort of thing possible?
Potentially. So the way the bond program works, the Constitution has a list of things for which it is acceptable to bond. And we have to figure out what would fit into those categories that would address a worthy purpose, like garbage reduction. That's also one of the reasons, in contrast to 103, I would urge a yes vote on Measure 102, relates to affordable housing, but is a technical change that would allow the bonding we can do to be more effective and go further. So we try to make our case to the legislature about what are good investments for bonds. They retain the ability to say you can bond, we're going to bond for that and that, but not that. So we try to make the case for things that have a long-run payback. And there are certainly examples of energy efficiency where that's true. We're doing matching bonds for local school districts that approve funding for new construction and renovation, both for energy efficiency and for seismic resilience, for example. But this, as with most cases, is a question of details and what's the specific program that the legislature would support. Thanks.
Hello, I'm Sally Hopkins, and okay, first of all, I have a daughter who goes to works for Nike now. One thing I wanted to say about Nike is I've never seen more beautiful women or more handsome men, and they're all young.
So you go to lunch with her a lot? You go,
I do.
Okay,
I do. The other thing is she also rode for the crew team, but not here.
Okay.
Up at the University of Washington.
Well, that's my other alma mater, so that's okay too.
Yes, okay. But anyway, what I was wondering is, with all the things you said, have you ever intended to go any further in politics or to maybe become our governor?
What I have learned, thank you for the nice question, what I've learned in my short time in politics is that one of the fastest ways to be disappointed is to have a really specific plan. I'm constantly repeating Willamette's motto in my head and looking for ways to be helpful. I really love this job, and I'm going to run for re-election next year, next cycle in 2020. Beyond that, who knows?
Hi, this is Bill.
Hi, Bill.
The zero rate of savings for so many people is very scary. Can you tell us whether the people in Oregon are better than the average or worse than the average or on the average?
I think they're about average, and you could probably slice that in different ways for different demographics. But that, I think, is what is the really powerful and exciting thing about Oregon Saves. If people are intentionally or automatically enrolled near the beginning of their career, and they take this account or something similar throughout their career, they get into that habit almost without knowing it. They'll accumulate some assets and be surprised by the choices that are available at the end. There's a guy who works at Mount Ashland who did a video for us that just sticks in my mind always. Clearly, this guy has been working at a food service job. He's struggling, and he says stuff like, "I can see a future for myself. I feel like I'm getting ahead, and this, every month I can see it adding up." And the way his eyes light up, I mean, that's kind of what I think that's what we all want for our neighbors and family and every Oregonian. So we're trying to. Anybody here read Richard Thaler's work, Nudge, and the Nobel economist? He describes, he and his co-author, this is not a comment I can make, but to an educated audience like this, he describes them as libertarian paternalists. We're going to let you do what you want, but try to make it easier to do what's in your own best interest. So that's what we're trying to do.
Question over here, Joel again. Do nonprofits, this is a real easy question, I think.
I hope so.
Do nonprofits qualify for the Oregon Saves program?
Yes.
They do, okay.
Yes, absolutely, yeah. And just to follow up on that a little bit, we've started with large employers, and we're now down to a requirement for those who have 50 or more employees. We'll keep rolling that down, but later this year, we're also going to open it up for people who want to self-enroll. So if someone happens to work at an employer who offers a plan but not to them, or if they're self-employed or part of the growing gig economy, they can also enroll and take advantage of being part of that big pool and low cost. Thank you.
Hi, this is Janet.
Hi, Janet.
You've talked about the success of the Oregon Saves and the importance of the Oregon Saves program. Anybody ever thought about a corollary with Oregon Borrows? I know about at least 10 years ago, restrictions on payday loans and title loans went into effect that really reduced that rightfully reduced those kinds of businesses. But for the very low income, their choices of getting money to do something are really slim. What do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I was in the legislature for that when then Speaker Merkley really led the charge on limiting the presence of payday lenders, and I do think that was a really good result. We spend time talking with community banks and credit unions about what they can offer, both in terms of financial literacy programs and in terms of specific loan products. I think it would be difficult in our current budget environment to carve out or stand up a new program, but making sure that particularly those nonprofit credit unions are serving their communities, that's been a real opportunity. We'll keep talking with them. Thanks for the reminder. It's good.
Hi, Tobias. I'm Russ.
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh. Yeah, right.
Uh-oh. I think we have to wait.
Oh, okay, sure.
Hi, Terry here.
Hi, Terry.
Recently, the PERS IAP switched over to target date funds, and my impression is that Treasury doesn't want to allow the individual owners to choose which target date fund applies to them. They want it to be done on their age. Can you tell me if that's true, or whether there is a plan to allow the customer to choose?
Yes. So let me take a moment to bring the rest of the crew up to speed on this question. So inside PERS, there's something called the IAP, the Individual Account Program, which is essentially a defined contribution component of an overall plan. So it is defined contribution, not defined benefit. And until recently, a very scary thing for me was the fact that that whole IAP was invested with no difference than the fund as a total. So a 27-year-old state employee would have exactly the same exposure as a 62-year-old state employee, and that is not good. We want that 27-year-old to have plenty more risk and the 62-year-old to have a lot less risk. So that's where we move to this notion. We are not opposed to the idea of some choice on the part of individuals, but we need to have the legal protection, the safe harbor, so that someone who made that choice and suffered a loss would not then be able to come back to the plan and say, you gave me this choice and it's your fault. So there are discussions gearing up for the legislature about how to add that protection. I think it is potentially a reasonable compromise to allow the choice amongst different target date funds, since that would be some bumpers. But we got to get those protections in place before that's available. Does that help? Great. Dr. Beaton.
Don't worry. Both Tom and I realize you were really listening.
Okay. You're grading on a curve. Thank you.
Yeah, we've talked about this, and I know you have some reservations, but would you share with us the pros and cons, as you see it, of a state bank such as North Dakota has?
I think the people who want a state bank are interested in a lot of understandable and laudable purposes. The fact is that we get a lot of those already in Oregon. We deposit money locally. There are loan guarantee programs. About the only thing we don't have is a building that says Bank of Oregon on it. In addition to that, the Constitution is pretty clear and says you can't have a state bank. Of course, we change the Constitution from time to time in Oregon. But even if we did that, I'm not as sure about what problem we're actually solving by taking that on. I think we're better off looking for ways to do more of those loan guarantee programs and ability to tap into the expertise that already exists in our community banks and credit unions to serve local institutions. Way in the back. Oh, no,
Meredith Gilbert here.
Sorry.
Since Oregon depends on revenue quite heavily with property taxes, and we've nixed sales taxes 6 times, you had mentioned earlier that maybe we could raise revenue with consumption taxes. What would your ideas be? Taxes on what kind of consumption?
Carbon.
Ah, thank you.
The first one-word answer I've gotten to give. Thank you.
Hi, this is Maureen. You mentioned climate change a couple of times as something that you consider. And before knowing something that we experienced, I wouldn't have thought that would enter. But we came 15 years ago from Santa Rosa, California, that experienced those terrible wildfires last year. Our family and friends who are still there were affected. And as a result of losing almost 6,000 homes and businesses in a town about the size of Salem, they are now struggling with a reduced tax base and an inability to fully fund their fire, police, library, schools, you name it. And the fires, the strength of those fires is attributed to climate change. So if you would mention how you perceive that.
I don't think I can add much to what you said. I think there are lots of other examples that are similar. The Shakespeare Festival in Ashland this year suffered millions of dollars in losses because they had to cancel performances as a result of the forest fires. You all know better than I the experience with drinking water in Salem. They're not theoretical. They're not in the future. The impacts are real and they are current. And as fiduciaries, as investors, I think we are falling short if we're not accounting for those things as we make decisions. So we hired the first investment officer focused exclusively on environmental, social, and governance risks. Anna Totedahl is her name. She's helping us build our capacity for that. And importantly, she is not sitting off in a metaphorical corner of the portfolio. She's part of the risk and research team, and her work needs to be central to every part of our portfolio. So, is this company we're invested in, do they have their supply chain in a place that's vulnerable to hurricanes? Are they using renewable energy? Do they have an appropriately diverse board based on who's there and their ability to spot opportunities and mitigate risks? All these things are key to our ability to generate returns for our beneficiaries. And they also happily coincide with our values and aspirations. So I think we have to do that or we're not doing our job.
I'm a little confused on the ballot measure to provide affordable housing. As it was explained to a group of us by, I think it was a League of Women Voters, they will use property taxes to give to private investors or developers to build this housing. There was no clarity on who would collect the rents from these, how the bonds would be paid back, what was the collateral.
Yep.
And I was rather confused on where to go with that.
So I'll explain a little bit more. So the Constitution has a list of things, as I mentioned earlier, that are acceptable purposes for the use of bond funds. One of those is affordable housing. But as the Constitution currently reads, those projects have to be owned or operated by the state in order to use bond funds. So Measure 102 would allow for public-private partnerships to receive the benefits, to receive proceeds from bond funds. It does not answer the specific questions you asked, because that would, of course, depend on a specific project and location and all that sort of stuff. But it makes it possible for those bonds to be used for that purpose. It still has to go through the same process in the legislature to be approved and sold and be part of a comprehensive plan, but the details would depend on the location. Does that help? Well, they're making it possible. They're filling a gap potentially. So if a developer doesn't feel like they can afford to do a specific plan or a specific project on their own, the bond fund might be the gap that makes that project go. So I think I'm voting yes because I think it's an additional tool. It's not a panacea. It doesn't mean that we will suddenly have solved our lack of affordable housing, but I think it's an additional tool. As I've seen where we have wanted, the legislature has wanted to put money towards affordable housing, but it can't go as far as it otherwise could because it can't be married up with private funding. So lots of details to figure out in individual projects, but as a tool that's available, I think it's a yes.
Hello. I have a question about passive investing. Does the state have a lot of money in passive index funds or not?
We do. I think, as with everything, there's a temptation, and I'm not accusing you of this, but there's a temptation on the part of some to say, here's the answer, and everything should be in that answer. absolutely passive and index investing plays an important role, and there are places where we want exposure to the market, and passive and indexing makes a lot of sense. There are other places where that doesn't make sense, and one of our big challenges is to construct a portfolio that is built for the long run, that doesn't just ride the ups and downs of the market. So indexing looks great when the market is going up. It doesn't look so good when it's going down. So we're all about reducing the costs where we can, but also seeking out non-correlated assets. So we have more exposure than some of our peers to private markets, private equity, real assets, and to be really tangible. Trees don't particularly care what the stock market is doing. They're going to, we have climate change risks, of course, but they're going to grow regardless of what the market is doing. So we want to build a very diversified portfolio that takes us from the Alps of the market to kind of rolling hills. We're not likely to ever be the highest returns that you'll see, but hopefully we're not ever going to be the lowest either.
Excuse me. My name is Paul, and I had a 30-year career with a federal agency called Farmers Home Administration, aka Rural Development. And we made a lot of direct loans for financing affordable housing. We made them for rental housing. It was housing authorities, nonprofits, individuals, and LLC, the corporations for tax breaks. And all I can say is the most efficient, as long as you're monitoring and keeping controls on it, the most efficient way in terms of costs and even affordable rents was to go via the private sector, which had more incentive to manage their operation tightly and keep it up. So no offense to government in this case, but my experience with housing authorities was not a good one from the proper, for good use of the money.
I think that's a useful comment, and part of what's attractive to me about Measure 102 is trying to use that expertise that exists in the private sector. Thanks for that. I'm watching the microphone. Here it comes.
You've used the term revenue reform is needed. We've heard a lot about specific revenue tax issues, but from a macro vantage point, if you were to identify the top 3 or 4 areas for revenue reform that would make the state stronger in the future for things like public education and other kinds of things, what would those revenue reforms be?
I look around and see whether my team is cowering as I have answered this. Well, I guess what I'll do is quote the rating agencies. They evaluate us on a regular basis, and the last report that I read from them, each of them gave us 1 notch below the top rating. They each have slightly different scales and systems, but we're 1 notch below. And what was interesting was what they pointed to as the reasons we were not the top credit rating. This is a smart group. Does anyone want to guess any of those top 3 issues? Over-reliance on the income tax. That's 1. Not surprising. You got 1 here. Okay. Kicker is 2. That's right. And the 3rd? This one might be a little bit harder. The initiative system. All of these, what unites these, I think, is the notion of a lack of stability and predictability. And there's plenty of debate to be had about how exactly to address each of those things. But to answer your question, I think the things that promote greater stability so that we can be thinking about how best to design and operate programs and services rather than being stuck in a cycle where we're just trying to keep the doors and lights, the doors open and the lights on. So maybe there's more debate for us to have. Yeah, thanks.
Tobias, I don't usually share my grades publicly, but I think I can make an exception in this case because
Isn't there HIPAA involved here or something?
I think pretty much everybody agrees with me. That was an A+ presentation.
Thank you.